So, picking back up on our section on self identity and social identity. But before we get started, some quick updates and reminders. Quiz 3 is due this Friday at 11:59 p.m. Make sure that you're watching the supplementary videos and that you finish the assigned reading for this week. So, a quick review, and I thought what would be a good exercise today because, like, identity theory and social identity theory, they're very similar, but they're also very different. But those similarities can make it a bit difficult to distinguish which is which and the utility of each theory. So, we're going to go over some of the questions from your activity and to give you some ideas of what you could have been thinking about, the types of concepts and terms you could have incorporated. And of course, you could have taken in a different direction than the examples that are provided here, which is perfectly fine. But this is just to give you kind of a better idea of how you could take each question while also discussing, having the opportunity to discuss some of its applications and how it can be applied to your everyday life. Okay, so a quick review of identity theory. It essentially concerns like the self consists of this collection of identities based on role identities. And so within sociology, there's this focus on statuses that break into roles. So, like your status as a um, daughter might break into various different roles, like the role of a daughter to your to one parent and a role of the daughter to another, and then whatever sorts of roles and expectations are associated with that. But for the purpose of this class, I think it would just be a lot easier to discuss them in terms of calling all these things different roles, like your role as a student, an employee, a son, daughter, sister, brother, cousin, aunt, uncle, friend, whatever. So again, the self consists of these collections of identities based on role identities. And so when we're talking about identity theory, it is very much focused on our personal identities, like how we think of ourselves, like are we a risk taker? Are we particularly selfless or compassionate? But first and foremost, it's very much focused on the different roles we occupy in our everyday life and the expectations that are associated with that. And then role identities, because of those expectations, influence our behavior. Um, so, one thing that we discussed in the section on symbolic interaction is that, again, one of the biggest critiques of symbolic interaction was that there wasn't enough focus on social structure. There was too much focus on the individual and subjective meaning. And so their response to that was impression management. This is how society remains stable over time. This is how things are organized because people are trying to meet particular expectations. And so they play this role. They tried to manage the way that other people perceive them. And so identity theory is kind of leaning into that, but more so focused on how you perceive yourself and how others' expectations of you influence yourself and how you view your own self, and also how you construct yourself and how you behave with others based on these roles. And that's because of the expectations associated with those roles. And so if we go back to impression management, that's kind of how they would explain society remaining stable over time in that organization. Identity theory would really focus on that very specific aspect um, and say that this is how the individual is tied to the greater society because of these roles and expectations. And so they're trying to maintain expectations associated with these roles for themselves, for how others perceive them, but also themselves. So, how am I supposed to behave and think and interact and so on, and how I'm supposed to relate to others. And then finally, identities are embedded within situations, meaning that identities are activated when self meanings align with situational meanings. So you're defining the situation. You are invoking particular identities based on what that situation calls for. And then social identity theory states that humans categorize other humans to identify and understand them. And so focusing on things like prototypes and how it reduces individuality, which is in this case not necessarily a bad thing, but it reduces um, individuality in terms of its classifying people into a variety of different groups. So you can still be very much an individual in terms of your specific combination of groups that you're a part of and the ways in which you identify and construct your own identity. But within those groups, it kind of prescribes and describes your behavior as well as others. So we tend to categorize each other as a way of organizing society. And then we adopt these group identities, which can increase self-esteem, and it also reduces uncertainty. So it gives us an idea of what we can expect, how we can expect others to react, and it kind of gives us a bit of a script on how we are supposed to behave across situations based on these identities. So if you're a student and you walk into a classroom, you know for the most part what's expected of you. It reduces a lot of that uncertainty and ambiguity in a situation. And if you're tied to a group that's of a particularly high status, it can increase your self esteem. And then we also compare our group to other groups. So even if we're not necessarily discriminating out group members or behaving and thinking in a prejudiced way, um, we do tend to still judge the out group differently than our own in groups. So we evaluate ourselves within the group. Um, we evaluate ourselves against the criteria of what it means to be a part of that group. And then we evaluate ourselves compared to people in other groups. And with that, of course, we can use stereotypes of other people's groups because we don't really know what's expected within that group because we're not a part of that group. So all we have to work on there is that kind of stereotyped view of what it means to be a member of that group. Okay, so reviewing some of these questions, the first section dealt with social identity theory. And social identity theory focuses on how variations in the social situation, meaning the relevant outgroup, the beliefs about the degree of mobility and social change possible, um, and how the variations in social situations go on to influence the content of those meanings for the in group. So, those situated self meanings. So, what does it mean within this context? And that also applies to the out group. So, those stereotypes and what it means across situations. So a situation isn't just like, okay, I'm going to react this way given this situation. You're also thinking, this is how this other group should behave, and this is how I should behave in relation to them given this context. And maybe there isn't an outgroup present because you're invoking, you know, there's a different identity um, that makes sense in that moment and that doesn't necessarily present an outgroup. But when it does, that's when you are thinking of the outgroup in this more stereotypical way, again, because you don't really know what it means to be a part of that group. And, if the situation is, particularly competitive, that can result in discrimination. And so, from this perspective, identity salience is not a stable part of the self. And that's a result of commitment. So, thinking of commitment to different types of groups, so that like common identity group, attachment, so the on the attachment portion, and the common bond attachment to a group. But then you think of your commitment, meaning your interactional commitment. So, how many people you know who are tied to this particular identity, and that effective commitment. So, the quality of the relationships, regardless of number, that are tied to that particular identity. Um, and so, again, from this perspective, identity salience is not a stable part of the self, and it is conceptualized as the impact of the situation on self categorizations, meaning in different venues, there are different meanings for these categorical identities depending on the salient outgroup at the time. Okay, so moving to questions 1 and 2. So, social identity theory sees social actors as having multiple identities that get activated by different social contexts. Here, the emphasis is on category memberships. So, consider the elements of your own identity. And the questions ask which identities have the strongest effect on how you perceive yourself, and which have the greatest effects on how others perceive you and why. So, some of the concepts you could incorporate when addressing this question when formulating a response is again you're looking on how you perceive yourself and how others perceive you, and so this is from a social identity perspective. So thinking of group prototypes, group stereotypes, and then how those things build conformity, trust, and solidarity among group members. So if you're thinking about like, let's go with how others perceive you, because these things are kind of um, intertwined. Again, because when you're viewing the self, you are viewing that from the perspective of others because we are socialized social beings. So these things are kind of, in a lot of ways, very much connected and reciprocal. But so for group prototypes, if you're thinking of how you perceive yourself, um, how are you evaluating yourself in relation to different identities and the prototype associated with each of those? What are the characteristics and the criteria? How well are you embodying the that criteria and those characteristics of what it means to be a part of those groups? Um, and how are you evaluating yourself not just in relation to those characteristics, but in relation to others in the group? And then for how others perceive you, particularly in terms of stereotypes and how this is specifically related to your own life. But thinking of times when people have treated you in a way that indicates that they are perceiving you and through like this lens that this stereotypical view of how someone who's a part of whatever identity, whatever group it is, that they're clearly perceiving you in a way where they're seeing only the stereotyped version of that and not this more nuanced, complex um, person who's a part of this group or has this particular identity. So thinking about times where it's clear that someone has stereotyped you in a particular way based on your interactions, or thinking about interactions that you've had with others or they've had with you, times where you were more likely to conform to particular standards, uh, fostering trust and solidarity. So, times when someone has stood up for you and stood in solidarity with you on a particular issue, or where someone has kind of instinctively trusted you, or you've instinctively trusted them. And what does that mean in terms of how you see each other as being a part of the same group or being part of different groups? So, if you see yourself as being a part of the same group, you're more likely to trust one another and more likely to stand in solidarity with one another. And so, when thinking about which ones have the strongest effect on how others perceive you, and how you perceive yourself, you can think about the ones like how you evaluate yourself, the criteria you use, and if you're constantly measuring yourself in relation to certain criterias, well, what identities are those associated with? And what ways are people treating you in more of a stereotypical way? Or people are more likely to trust you based on certain characteristics or stand in solidarity with you based on certain characteristics? Which situations are you more likely um, to conform to, or people are more likely to conform to kind of your behavior within a situation? And what that can tell you a lot about the identities that um, are most relevant in terms of how you see yourself and how others see you. So, moving on to questions 3, 4, and 5. So, it says when category membership becomes salient, self perception and conduct become in group normative. Again, consider the elements of your own identity in terms of the above categories that are mentioned in the assignment. Think of a time when one of these categories became particularly relevant to the social context in that way, or in a way that to some degree shifted your self perception and behavior to better reflect what is expected of someone in that group. So the questions ask you to define the situation, How did you know it was salient? What prompted you? What about the social context prompted you? How did it shift your self perception? And in what ways did your behavior, language expressions change to better reflect in group normative conduct? How did you know this conduct was in group normative? And were you treated differently as a result? So, and again, this is thinking of it kind of stereotypically because I'm a millennial and not Gen Z. So, forgive me if some of these are a bit stereotypical. Uh, but kind of example that I came up with was, so let's say that you're participating in a focus group and you realize you are by far the youngest person there. And so as a result, you realize it is important to represent the views of your generation more than your own personal views. Because let's say this focus group, it wants to kind of get these generational differences and how people in these different generational cohorts view different problems and issues in your community. And so you suddenly realize, I'm the only person my age here. I need to make sure that I'm not necessarily representing my own personal views, but that I'm speaking for my peers who aren't present. And so I am now a representative of Generation Z. And so, again, going back to that kind of depersonalization of you're not just this person, you're this representative of your group. And then in the moment, you did not view yourself as a, let's say, college educated middle class woman, but instead a voice of your generation. And in the long term, this made you more aware of your responsibility as a member of Gen Z. And so it kind of shifted your self perception in that way that, okay, I do have this responsibility as a member of my generation. We have certain, values and goals, and I need to work harder or work differently to promote those goals and share those values. And so you're seeing yourself, you're identifying more closely with yourself as a member of this particular generation. And then for normative conduct, so let's say, for example, you decide to join a local group of like-minded peers to discuss different issues in the community, and you begin to more actively speak up against social issues or about social issues. And again, that's something that's kind of a stereotypical view of Gen Z, but Gen Z, from all the research, and I know that some things I think are a bit off. I know they are for millennials, but Gen Z, for those of you who are Gen Z, tend to be more socially aware, more likely to speak up and speak out, and you feel very much empowered to have your voice heard. Um, and so, this is kind of, you know, in group normative because, of course, you're interacting with your peers on a regular basis. There's, movies and television and on social media, and you're seeing these interactions. Among your peers, you're having interactions, you're viewing and consuming this media, and it's made very clear to you that these are certain things that are expected of what it means to be a part of this generation, which is part of the reason why there are these generational cohorts in the first place, is that you grow up in a very specific context, and that kind of shapes all the young people in their formative years, and they tend to have um, similar outlooks on the world. Even if their beliefs vary widely, they tend to have a lot of things in common because they were socialized within the same context at the same time and at the same age. And so over time, you begin to feel more included with your peers, um, but you find that you're actually treated differently. Maybe, for example, more skepticism by those who are much older than you, because now you are differentiating yourself much more. You are identifying much more with your generation, Gen Z. And so you are then, at least in your persona and how you're being perceived, diverging a bit more from making yourself more distinctly a part of that particular generation. And each generation is different and kind of has different goals and values and ways of seeing the world. So that's just one example um, that, again, you wouldn't have used this for to answer these particular questions, but an example of how you could have discussed this. So you could have really highlighted these topics of salience and self perception and normative conduct. and making sure you're hitting all of those points. So, moving on to questions 6 through 10. And so, the kind of preface to this is that perceptions of other groups become outgroup stereotypical. Depending on the nature of the relationship between the groups, self self perceptions and perceptions of the other can shift toward different types of perceptual bias as actors are motivated to make comparisons that favor the in group and sometimes disparage the out group. And the strength of this tendency varies depending on the potential for mobility, status, prestige, so on. And it is stronger for immutable characteristics, or immutable, ascribed categorizations like race, sex, nationality, and so on, than for achieved categorizations like educational attainment, memberships in sports teams, occupation, etc., especially if the higher status is within reach. So, therefore, the social environment, and in particular, the relevant group contrast within this environment, determine what dimensions of self perception, other stereotyping, and intergroup competition or discrimination occur. And so, some of the main concepts and terms you could have integrated into your discussion of these questions are really focusing in on outgroup stereotyping. So, perceptions of other groups become outgroup stereotypical. And again, that's based on the nature of these relationships, whether or not they're competitive or status ranked or so on. Maybe you're working together towards a common goal, even. And comparisons and perceptual bias, you could have focused in on self stereotyping and how that favors the in group, or ways in which it disparages the out group. So, stereotyping or discrimination or prejudice. And the motivation, another key point you could have incorporated is the motivation for identifying with particular self categorizations. So, based on self esteem, which is specifically um, referred to or more formally referred to as self enhancement, or that uncertainty reduction. And also incorporating uh, discussions of like the potential for mobility. So, as it states, like the social environment and the relevant, out group within this environment determine what dimensions of self perception, other stereotyping, and intergroup competition or discrimination occur. So, you could have discussed, again, looking at the situation and how it makes particular characteristics more relevant within your group and also across groups. Um, and so, looking at one dimension is the potential for mobility. So, the potential for some sort of gain, whether it be in status or prestige or money or a trophy or bragging rights or, whatever the case may be. So, just a quick example, highlighting each of these questions. I used one example from my own life that I thought might be good for these particular sets of questions. So, when it asked what about the social context prompted you to recognize this identity as salient? And so, before we go through these, so the example I immediately thought of was one time in high school we were going to a basketball game, and I grew up in a more rural area, a smaller town. There's one high school, um, and we were at Oklahoma City, went to a basketball game at a private school, and we had done this before, but upon walking into the school, really all we're thinking about is, it's a private school. It's probably very well funded. They probably get a great education, and their school's probably really nice. They probably don't have like trash cans in the hallway. Um, for to catch all the water from the leaky roof and all this stuff. It's probably going to be like this really nice venue, which is going to be fun. Um, but when we walked in, the student section, they were dressed up for the game, which is a fairly common thing. You dress up, maybe there's different themes, or maybe you do something kind of silly. And so, kind of one of the cliched things is to like hold up a newspaper when the other team is shooting, or maybe they try to make noise. Typically, what you see. again, or there's some kind of theme. But we walked in, and the student section was dressed up in this very, very negative stereotype of people from rural areas. And it was very, very offensive. Like, it wasn't just they dressed up kind of country, like, they specifically dressed up as if they, were like missing teeth, and their clothes were really raggedy, and like just lots of other things that I don't really feel comfortable discussing here, but it was very, very negative and very, very offensive and hurtful. And, before that, we, we just saw other students. Yes, they were like the opposing team, but I mean, for the most part, other than that, like, we are more alike than we were different. We're all students. We're all, here to watch the game. We're all teenagers, and that was kind of it. But you just go to a different school, and there wasn't really much beyond that. And of course, the nature of this relationship was, it was, I would say, more so competitive, just because we were on opposing teams and we were there specifically for a competitive event. Um, and what there was to gain in this, and again, I guess you could say, winning the game, or perhaps they were trying to kind of, break our morale to some extent. But overall, I would say maybe status. Um, whether it be for the game itself, or it was that there was something to gain by uh, making us feel a certain way or respond a certain way. I'm not sure, but I would say probably the nature of it was, or what there was to gain was status as a result of this. They were trying to demonstrate that they were better, whether that be in sports or in other areas. But maybe that's what they were trying to communicate. And the next question asks, like, did these comparisons shift your self-perception in the moment or in the long term? Why or why not? And this particular instance definitely shifted my perception in the long term, because walking in, we had never before thought about these different identities, like rural versus, rural versus urban and suburban, or private versus public school, or wealthy versus, not wealthy. Because before then, class was more of like on the individual level, like some people have more than others. And that's just, it's kind of like this thing that's unique to every person. Every person has their own unique set of circumstances. And we hadn't really seen it before as this kind of overarching structure, that some of us are, working class, some are middle class, some are upper middle class, or whatever the case may be. We didn't really see these commonalities across time and place. And so then we start to begin to see this larger class structure, was being revealed to us. But also these categories we didn't even know existed, like rural versus urban and suburban, or private versus public school. We didn't really see it. Was, again, something that had existed on the individual level. And we didn't even really, because there's no private schools in our town. So, we knew people went to private schools, but for us, it was never really like, "Oh, we go to a public school." It was just, we go to the school. So, it was revealing to us these very different, um, categories, and so because of that, that shifted our self-perception as we began to kind of see ourselves, um, through the lens of these categories, whether or not we necessarily agreed with them, beginning to understand that people were perceiving us this way, people who did know of these categories and the prototypes and stereotypes associated with each. And so, as a result of these interactions and these group dynamics, did the nature of the relationship between the groups shift? And it created conflict in the moment, certainly. Um, but between us, kind of beyond that one specific evening, I went to a camp later that summer, and I actually met a group of girls who went to that school. And upon meeting them, I was a little suspicious, because of that event, I had created certain stereotypes of them and who they would be, and I knew, because I knew, or I assumed, that they had certain stereotypes of who I was. Um, but, we were kind of working together on the same team. And we got to know each other and found out that, they were super nice. They were really nice. Um, they didn't seem to see me through this they didn't treat me in a way that made me think that they were seeing me as like this stereotype. And, that shifted my understanding of them and realizing that um, these groups, we can all, we can, let's say, you have the big group of, public school kids who go to public schools and kids who go to private schools. But that doesn't mean like every single person in those groups is the same, that these are just these categories that we've created. And there are certain stereotypes about each in certain ways that you're expected to behave within each. And oftentimes, that prototype and that stereotype do not align. That how you're seen by the um, out group is very different than how you see yourself within the group, and vice versa. And sometimes that's for better, and sometimes that's for worse. But again, this is just an example of how you could have gone through these questions and the types of things you could have brought up and discussed, and specifically. The question about like how it changed your self perception, I think is really important here. And discussing, like I said, for me, it introduced me to these categories. And because I was now introduced to these categories, I could evaluate myself within the group and in comparison to people outside of that group. Okay, so moving on to identity theory. So questions 11 and 12. So, identity theory views the self as multifaceted and composed of multiple identities, which are arranged hierarchically in an identity salient structure. This means that identities are ranked or could be arranged in terms of importance, like a pyramid of sorts. And the questions ask um, what identities do you think about most often? Why do you think about them more often than others? And what identities do you think about least often? And why do you think about them um, less often than you do others? So, some of the kind of three areas you could have incorporated here were self meanings and situational meanings. So, again, the question is asking which identities you think about um, more often or less often. So, really, we're talking about kind of that identity salience and that definition of the situation. So, going back to the definition of the situation, meaning that's when those self meanings and situational meanings align. And because of that, that means that a certain identity is salient. And so, if you're invoking an identity more often than others, you're going to obviously be thinking about it more. And if you're not invoking it as often, it's something perhaps you're not going to think about as often. And so, focusing in on self meanings, um, meaning like what characteristics make you distinct from others? What's your sense of self? So you could hone in on that identity verification and non-verification, how people react to you when you invoke this particular identity, and how you respond to their verification or non-verification of that particular identity. And then situational meaning. So again, this, part of the definition of the situation. Um, and these expectations based off of like these roles and norms and prior experiences. Because this is going into identity theory, specifically focusing in on the expectations associated with particular roles, and so that impression management. Um, there within the situation, there are certain expectations for how you are to behave and interact with people. And so you're thinking about your different identities that you could invoke and which ones align more with these expectations and how I'm supposed to behave. Even if it's not necessarily like perfectly aligned with that situation, you're drawing from what you have, kind of like your your available resources. And then, of course, commitment. So that interactional commitment, which one are you invoking more often just because you have a large number of relationships based on that identity? So for me, like I'm invoking my instructor identity a lot this semester because we are not going into the office. I'm either in the classroom or I'm at home with my roommate. So most of my interactions, bulk of them are associated with my instructor role. So I'm thinking about that a lot more. And then your effective commitment to a particular um, identity. So you have more meaningful relationships based on this. And so, especially like, maybe right now you're spending more time with friends and family. And so, even though we'll go with family, like your role as a daughter, you're a daughter to, one or two people in the world. And so, you don't have, a large number of ties based on that identity, but you have a very strong relationship with those individuals. And so this role is maybe particularly important to you. And so you're thinking about it a lot more because you're able to spend a little bit more time with them. Maybe you're, concerned about your parents or they're concerned about you. And so you're thinking a lot more about that identity right now. And finally, or going to question 13, consider the factors that influenced and make up your unique personality. So, like your favorite music, skills and achievements you're proud of, favorite book, movie, food, personal motto, adjectives that you would use to describe yourself. In what ways are these things related to, influenced by, or shaped by your identities? And so some of the things you could have incorporated here were like identity verification, status and roles, effective commitment. So, like for identity verification, thinking of like maybe your preferred genres of music or movies. So, you see yourself as a risk taker. And so you tend to watch more action movies. And thinking of first person point of view songs, which ones do you prefer, and what sort of message are they saying about you and the identities that and the roles that you occupy. So right here, I looked up the most popular songs of 2019, and one of the first one, the only one I recognized for the most part was Billie Eilish. And so if you're like, that song she says, "I'm the bad guy," and so whatever that song means to you, and you're singing it, how does that correspond with a particular role you play? So let's say you're singing it about, a significant other, or rather, kind of about the context. But again, it's a first person point of view song. So you're singing that, and maybe it's associated with your identity as, someone's partner or friend or whatever the case may be. And then favorite book. And here, this example might be a little bit different. So let's say you're someone who people perceive as being particularly smart, and in order to receive that verification, you need to behave in ways that are consistent with what it means to be very smart and like educated. And so when you talk about the books you're reading, maybe instead you want to read like some sort of like young adult novel that's more fun. But instead you're like, oh no, like you decide to choose books that you don't particularly care for, but you read because you think that's what you are supposed to do as this person. So instead of reading like, I don't know, Twilight, whatever is the popular young adult books right now, um, that is a very dated reference, but let's go with that. Instead of reading something kind of like that, you're like, oh, I'm reading, one of the classics, or I'm reading like Foucault, which is very, kind of dense and abstract. But then going on to status and roles. So, a very interesting example here would be like your favorite quote and how your roles tie into kind of things you like. So, I think every person who's ever ran track or been in cross country knows the quote, to give anything less than your best is to sacrifice the gift. And that's a quote from Steve Prefontaine, this very famous runner. And so that's just one example. But because of your role as an athlete, specifically as a runner, um, your favorite quote isn't just like something that like emerged from like within you, like you were born like loving this quote. It's because of your experiences and your exposures, and how that might particularly resonate with you because of your experiences as a runner and as an athlete. And specifically also because you share an identity with the person who you know, that quote was attributed to. And the same for movies like Remember the Titans. movies about your sports, that might also relate to your achievements as a team. And so maybe some of your, or being a part of that team. And so maybe the achievement you're most proud of is associated with that identity as an athlete or as a football player, baseball player, soccer player. And then effective commitment to particular roles. So, again, like being someone's significant other, being their partner. A lot of people, not all, but they have like your song with that person. Like, this is our song. And even though you're only, presumably, but maybe not, a significant other to one other person, that, you have a strong relationship with them. So, high effective commitment to that role. And so, certain songs are like your song. So, that might be, higher on your playlist, something you prefer to listen to. You can also think of like your favorite characters in television shows and movies. Like, my role as a daughter, I'm really close to my dad, and I really like the character Dr. House because he reminds me a lot of my dad. Uh, but of course, like all the positive things about Dr. House, I think they have kind of similar personalities in a way, and I kind of get a kick out of watching it, and I enjoy the show. And so think about like your favorite characters and what that says about your commitment to different aspects of your own identity. And then I put chicken soup here as an example, but maybe your mom or dad or grandma or grandpa or aunt, uncle, somebody, the types of food they would make when you were like sick or when you needed comfort. And so they would, that would kind of strengthen your relationship because they are aware of the food that made you feel better, but also later on you still find those foods comforting because these people who you loved so dearly would um, make these items for you when you needed to feel better. So those are just some things you could have touched on, the ways you could have looked at addressing this particular question. But moving on to questions 14 and 15. So um, it says, like, the more salient an identity, the higher the probability of it being invoked in an interaction, especially interactions where the person has some agency and choice in terms of their behavior. So, which identities do you invoke most and least often? Why? And so, here again, I just use myself as an example, ranking kind of the top three identities and their salience across situations. So, in the classroom, my most salient identity is that of an instructor. Um, and then student and then mentor. Whereas during an advising meeting, so that's with my advisor. And in graduate school, your advisor is another instructor in the department, and you're really close with them. You meet with them on a regular basis. And they typically just have, one or two other students at most who they're advising. And so when I'm in a meeting with her, first and foremost, I'm a student. But then I'm also a friend because I know her really well. We've known each other for quite a few years now. And so, second is friend, but then instructor, because occasionally we do talk about my roles as an instructor. But then during office hours um, with students, first and foremost, I'm an instructor, but then maybe a mentor. Maybe you're not necessarily wanting to discuss the class itself, but you have questions about um, being a student and being at OSU. And then third can be open because there's a variety of identities that can be invoked depending on your situation. Like if you need, help seeking other resources or you're really struggling with something, another identity might become more salient. And so that's just an example of kind of how you could have looked at these questions. And so for questions 16 and 17, identity salience is based on two dimensions of one's commitment to identity: interactional commitment and effective commitment. And so the questions ask which of your identities has the highest interactional commitment and which identities have the highest effective commitment. And so for these, which of your identities are tied to the most people and which of your identities are tied to your most valued relationships? And so moving on to questions 18 and 19. So, multi-level social structures both facilitate and constrain commitment to particular role identities. So, for example, at school, so these more meso level institutions like school strengthen your commitment to the student identity, but it may lessen your commitment to others. So, like your friend identity. Within the workplace, it strengthens your commitment to the employee identity, but it may reduce your um, student identity because a lot of your interactions are occurring in the workplace and it's taking up a lot of time. You're having to invoke that much more than you are your identity as a student. And so, how within a workplace that can, facilitate and constrain your ability to invoke that identity. So, maybe when you're in the workplace, you don't have time to maybe take a break and work on some of your schoolwork or work on it while you're at work. So, it's really constraining your ability to invoke that student identity. And then, like at church, I thought was a good example. It can strengthen your interactional commitment to religious identity. But once you move away and you're not, attending church on a regular basis, if at all, it might, of course, lessen that interactional commitment because most of your commitments aren't occurring on that basis and in association with that identity. But it might, end up strengthening your effective commitment to that because some of the people that you really value in your life were associated with that institution. And so once you've moved away, you are unable to operate in that institution and therefore kind of lose a lot of those ties related to that identity. And for the final question, question 20, ultimately, identity theory focuses on the self structure for motivating the enactment of identities and the long term social experience for the internalized meanings. So, based on your interactions with others and self perception over time, have you at all altered the time, place, and manner in which you enact different identities? How so? Why or why not? And so, um, just some examples for time, place, and manner. So, for time, let's say after realizing you were isolating yourself due to your identity as a student, you choose to limit your use of that identity on the weekends and instead invest more time in your friend identity. And for place, let's say while visiting your uncle who has different beliefs from your own, you decide that the role of nephew is much more important than your political identity. So as a result, you avoid discussing politics. And so you're not enacting this identity while at your uncle's house because you really value your role as this person's nephew. And then finally, manner. So as you get older and have different experiences, you discover a variety of means for, let's say, gender expression, which may be related to your occupation, sexual orientation, marital status, having children or not, and so on. And so, one example in terms of occupation is maybe you have to wear something very specific. Everyone, regardless of um, gender, has to wear the same thing. And so, maybe you are invoking your you know, identity in terms of gender. You're expressing that in different places at different times or in different ways given that situation. And so you've discovered different ways of doing this and kind of expressing yourself and the way you identify, maybe in different contexts or through different means. But other than that, that's all. Make sure that you complete quiz 3, complete the reading for this week, and watch the supplementary videos. Thank you.